20 years ago, Daniel Martinez was the brightest engineering student at State University, his hands steady as they sketched blueprints for bridges that would span rivers and towers that would touch clouds. His father, Miguel, a mechanic with calloused hands and infinite patience, had taught him that everything broken could be fixed if you understood how it worked. In their garage, surrounded by the metallic symphony of wrenches and hammers, father and son would spend weekends rebuilding engines, their movements synchronized like a well-rehearsed dance. Miguel would watch with pride as Daniel's young fingers learned the language of metal and motion, knowing his son was destined for greatness beyond the grease-stained concrete of their small world. The autumn of 1995 painted the campus in shades of gold and crimson, and Daniel walked those tree-lined paths with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where his life was heading. His professors spoke of him in hushed, reverent tones, the kind reserved for students who appear once in a generation. His thesis on structural dynamics was already being whispered about in academic circles, and 3 prestigious firms had extended job offers before he'd even graduated. But Daniel's proudest moments weren't in lecture halls or laboratories. They were still in that garage, still beside his father, still learning that the most beautiful equations meant nothing if you couldn't feel the problem in your hands. On a rainy Thursday evening in November, Daniel borrowed his father's vintage pickup truck to drive to the university library. The thesis defense was only weeks away, and he needed to verify some calculations that had been nagging at him like a persistent itch. Miguel had spent the afternoon working on the truck's brakes, his weathered hands coaxing life from worn brake pads, muttering about how the old girl just needed a little more time before she'd be perfect. He handed Daniel the keys with a smile that carried 20 years of shared memories, trusting his son with more than just a vehicle, trusting him with a piece of their history. The rain hammered against the windshield as Daniel drove through the winding mountain road that led back home. He was reviewing structural load calculations in his mind, his engineer's brain automatically analyzing the rhythm of the windshield wipers, the vibration of the steering wheel, the subtle pull to the right that suggested the alignment needed adjustment. But his thoughts were elsewhere, lost in the excitement of his upcoming presentation, the job offers waiting for his signature, the future that seemed to unfold before him like a perfectly drawn blueprint. The deer appeared in his headlights like a ghost materialized from the storm, its eyes wide with terror, frozen in the middle of the narrow road. Daniel's hands moved instinctively, yanking the steering wheel hard to the left, his foot slamming on the brake pedal with desperate force. But the brake pedal traveled too far, meeting the floorboard with a sickening thud that sent ice through his veins. The worn brake pads his father had been meaning to replace, the repair that needed just a little more time, had chosen this moment to surrender completely. The truck skidded sideways on the rain-slicked asphalt, tires screaming against the wet road like wounded animals, before launching into a sickening roll that seemed to last forever. When the world stopped spinning, Daniel hung upside down from his seatbelt, blood dripping from his forehead onto the shattered glass below. His father's body lay motionless beside him, neck twisted at an angle that spoke of finality, eyes closed as if he'd simply decided to sleep. The engineering student who could calculate the precise stress point of any material, who understood the physics of motion and impact, was powerless to change the simple equation that had stolen everything. Velocity plus mass plus worn brake pads equals the end of the world as he knew it. The funeral was a blur of black umbrellas and whispered condolences, but Daniel heard none of it. He stood beside the grave like a broken machine, his mother Elena's hand on his shoulder, the only thing keeping him tethered to the earth. She tried to speak to him about grief, about healing, about how his father would want him to continue. But Daniel's mind had locked onto a single, devastating truth. He was an engineer who had failed to engineer his way out of the one moment when it mattered most. The brake pads were worn, a simple maintenance issue that any competent mechanic would have caught, should have caught, would have fixed, if not for a son's impatience to reach the library, to chase a future that now tasted like ash in his mouth. The university granted him a leave of absence, professors understanding that grief takes time to process, that brilliant minds sometimes need space to heal. But Daniel never returned to those halls where his name had once been spoken with reverence. He couldn't bear to sit in classrooms where his professors would look at him with pity instead of pride, couldn't face the equations that reminded him of his failure to solve the only problem that truly mattered. His thesis gathered dust on his desk, the job offers were politely declined, and the future he'd planned crumbled like a poorly designed foundation. Elena watched her son disappear into himself, his engineering textbooks replaced by bottles that promised to numb the calculating mind that had become his tormentor. She tried to reach him, tried to remind him that accidents happen, that his father's death wasn't his fault, that wearing brake pads are a mechanical failure, not a moral one. But Daniel had constructed a prison of logic around his guilt, each bar forged from the knowledge that if he'd been more careful, more observant, more worthy of his father's trust, Miguel would still be alive. He was the engineer who couldn't engineer his way out of his own despair. On a cold morning in March, Elena found a note on Daniel's pillow, written in the precise handwriting that had once filled notebooks with structural calculations. It was brief, mathematical in its simplicity. "I'm sorry, Mom. I can't fix this, and I can't fix me. I love you, but I need to go away for a while. Please don't look for me." She clutched the paper to her chest as if it were her son himself, but Daniel had already vanished into the vast anonymity of America, carrying nothing but a broken heart and hands that no longer trusted themselves to hold anything precious. Elena spent years searching, hiring investigators, posting missing person reports, calling every engineering firm in the country. But Daniel had shed his identity like a snake sheds its skin, transforming from a promising student into a ghost who moved through the world without leaving traces. She would sometimes dream of him, still the 20-year-old boy with calloused hands and infinite potential, still working beside his father in their garage, still believing that everything broken could be fixed. If you've ever wondered how guilt can completely reshape a life, how a single moment can redirect the course of a human soul, then you need to subscribe to Reunions of Love, where we explore the profound ways that tragedy can transform us into people we never imagined we'd become. Hit that subscribe button and join us as we dive deep into stories that remind us just how fragile and precious our connections truly are. 20 years passed like water through Daniel's fingers, each day measured not in achievements or milestones, but in pipes repaired and leaks sealed. He'd become a different species of man, moving through the world with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd learned to fix everything except the thing that mattered most. His hands, once destined to design skyscrapers, now specialized in the humbler art of restoring flow to blocked drains and coaxing life from broken water heaters. He was Daniel Martinez, the plumber now, though he'd legally changed his name to Daniel Reyes years ago, cutting the final thread that connected him to the boy who'd once believed he could engineer his way to greatness. The work suited him in ways he'd never expected. There was honesty in plumbing, a straightforward causality that his tortured mind found soothing. Pipes leaked or they didn't. Water flowed or it didn't. Problems had solutions that didn't require genius, just patience and the willingness to get your hands dirty. He'd built a reputation for reliability in the small Colorado town where he'd settled, known as the plumber who showed up on time, worked quietly, and never left a job half-finished. His clients appreciated his thoroughness, the way he'd organize his tools in precise patterns, the methodical approach that seemed almost ritualistic in its precision. Daniel lived alone in a one-bedroom apartment above a hardware store, his space decorated with the stark minimalism of someone who'd learned not to accumulate things that could be lost. A bed, a table, a single chair, and a toolkit that represented the evolution of his father's lessons into something entirely different from what Miguel had intended. He ate simple meals, watched old movies, and fell asleep to the sound of pipes settling in the walls around him, a mechanical lullaby that reminded him he was still useful, still capable of solving problems, even if they weren't the problems he'd once dreamed of tackling. His phone rang with steady regularity, voices on the other end describing domestic catastrophes that needed his attention. Mrs. Patterson's kitchen sink had stopped draining. The Johnsons' water heater was making strange noises. The elementary school's bathroom had a leak that was threatening to flood the hallway. Daniel would load his truck with tools and drive to these small emergencies, approaching each job with the same methodical precision his father had taught him in their garage, back when the world made sense and future stretched ahead like an open road. He never spoke about his past to anyone, deflecting personal questions with the polite efficiency of someone who'd learned to live in the present tense. His clients knew him as a reliable professional who showed up when he said he would, fixed what needed fixing, and charged fair prices for honest work. They didn't know about the engineering degree he'd abandoned, the thesis that had never been defended, the brilliant future that had been traded for this quiet life of small repairs and steady solitude. Meanwhile, 300 miles away, Elena Martinez was learning to live with a different kind of broken pipe. At 75, her mind had become an unreliable narrator, her short-term memory flickering like a faulty electrical connection. The doctors at Sunset Manor had explained that her condition was progressive, that she would gradually lose her ability to form new memories, while the old ones remained crystalline clear. It was a cruel irony that someone who spent her days searching for her lost son would slowly lose the ability to remember the search itself. The staff at Sunset Manor had grown fond of Elena, a sweet woman who frequently confused their names, but never failed to thank them for their kindness. She had good days and bad days, moments of clarity scattered between stretches of gentle confusion. But regardless of her mental state, she always spoke with perfect clarity about Daniel, her brilliant son who used to fix everything in their house with the precision of a surgeon and the patience of a saint. She would describe in vivid detail how he organized his tools, how he approached problems with systematic logic, how his hands moved with the confidence of someone who understood the hidden mechanisms that kept the world functioning. Elena's room was decorated with photographs of Daniel at various ages, but the ones she treasured most were from the garage, pictures of a young man working beside his father, both of them focused on some mechanical puzzle with expressions of intense concentration. She would hold these photographs and tell the nurses stories about her son's genius, his full scholarship to engineering school, the professors who said he had the potential to change the world. She spoke about him in the present tense, as if he were simply away at college rather than vanished for 20 years, as if he might walk through her door at any moment with that shy smile and those capable hands. The other residents learned to listen patiently when Elena talked about Daniel, understanding that these memories were her most precious possessions, the treasures that remained intact while everything else faded. She would describe his methodical approach to problems, how he would lay out his tools in specific patterns, how he could diagnose mechanical issues with the intuition of someone who understood the language of metal and motion. Her voice would grow strong and clear when she talked about her son, the confusion lifting like morning fog to reveal the bedrock of maternal love beneath. The nursing home became Elena's world, a place where time moved slowly and gently, where routine provided the structure her failing memory needed. She participated in activities, made friends among the other residents, and found comfort in the predictable rhythm of institutional life. But her heart remained suspended in the past, waiting for the son who had promised to always take care of her, who had vanished into guilt and shame like smoke disappearing into an endless sky. The day the pipe burst in Sunset Manor's community room, it created the kind of domestic crisis that Daniel had been fixing for 2 decades. Water gushed from a joint connection behind the wall, flooding the activities area where the residents gathered for their daily programs. The staff scrambled to move the elderly residents to safety while placing buckets and towels around the growing puddle, but the leak was beyond their ability to manage. The maintenance supervisor called 3 plumbing companies before reaching Reyes Plumbing Services, where Daniel answered the phone with his characteristic professional efficiency. He arrived at Sunset Manor 30 minutes later, his truck loaded with the tools and supplies needed to address a major leak. The scene was controlled chaos, staff members directing residents away from the affected area, maintenance workers trying to locate the main water shutoff, and a spreading pool of water that threatened to reach the electrical outlets along the far wall. Daniel assessed the situation with the calm competence of someone who'd seen variations of this emergency dozens of times, his mind automatically calculating water pressure, pipe diameter, and the most efficient repair approach. The leak was located behind a decorative panel that needed to be removed, requiring Daniel to work in the cramped space between the wall and the damaged pipe. He knelt on the wet floor, his tools arranged in the precise pattern that had become second nature over 20 years of professional practice. Wrench, pipe cutter, compression fittings, and sealant, each tool positioned exactly where muscle memory knew it would be needed. It was a configuration his father had taught him in their garage, adapted now for the specific requirements of plumbing work, but retaining the methodical logic that Miguel had insisted was the foundation of all good repair work. As Daniel worked, the community room gradually filled again with residents who'd been relocated during the initial emergency. The leak was under control now, the immediate crisis resolved, but the actual repair would take time and careful attention to detail. Elena was among the residents who returned to the room, guided to her favorite chair near the window, where she could observe the activities around her. She watched with the patient interest of someone who had time to notice details, her failing memory paradoxically sharpening her attention to the present moment. Take a moment to consider the small habits and gestures that define the people you love. What tiny detail about someone's behavior would you recognize anywhere, even after 20 years of separation? Subscribe to Reunions of Love and share in the comments below. What's that one unmistakable trait that would help you identify your loved one in a crowd of strangers? Hit that notification bell so you never miss these incredible stories of connection and recognition. Elena observed Daniel's methodical approach to the repair work, the way he positioned his tools with surgical precision, the deliberate efficiency of movements that spoke of decades of practice. But something about his technique triggered a deep recognition, a memory that bypassed her damaged short-term processing and reached directly into the vault of long-term recollection where her most precious experiences remained intact. She'd seen these exact movements before, this particular arrangement of tools, this specific approach to mechanical problems. The recognition started as a whisper in her mind, a familiar rhythm that reminded her of Saturday mornings in a garage that smelled of motor oil and possibility. Daniel's hands moved with the same systematic precision she remembered from 20 years ago, the same careful organization that her son had learned from his father, the same methodical approach that had once convinced professors he was destined for engineering greatness. She watched him work for several minutes, her mind trying to reconcile the middle-aged plumber with the young man who lived in her memories. Daniel was completely absorbed in his work, focused on the delicate task of joining new pipe sections to the existing plumbing system. The repair required patience and precision, exactly the kind of problem-solving that had always brought him peace. He was aware of the residents watching him work, accustomed to being observed during his repairs, but he didn't look up from his tools or break the concentration that 20 years of professional practice had taught him was essential for quality work. Elena rose from her chair with the careful deliberation of someone whose body required conscious direction, her movements slow but purposeful as she approached the kneeling plumber. The other residents watched with mild curiosity, accustomed to Elena's occasional conversational overtures with staff members and visitors. She stopped just behind Daniel, close enough to observe the precise arrangement of his tools, the familiar pattern that had triggered recognition in her memory's deepest chambers. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the gentle confusion of someone whose mind moved between different decades without warning, but also the unmistakable authority of maternal recognition. "Why are you fixing it like my son?" she asked, the question emerging from someplace deeper than conscious thought, driven by an instinct that transcended the limitations of her failing memory. The sound of Daniel's wrench hitting the linoleum floor echoed through the suddenly silent community room like a gunshot in a cathedral. 20 years of careful emotional construction, 2 decades of controlled professional demeanor, a lifetime of guilt and self-imposed exile. All of it shattered in the space between one heartbeat and the next. His hands, steady as bedrock for countless repairs, began to tremble as he slowly turned to face the voice that had spoken to him in his dreams for 20 years. Elena stood behind him, her aged face marked by the gentle confusion of someone navigating between present reality and distant memory, but her eyes held the unmistakable recognition of a mother who had never stopped believing her son would come home. She looked at the middle-aged plumber kneeling before her, searching his features for traces of the 20-year-old boy who had vanished into guilt and shame, trying to reconcile the face she saw with the face that lived in her heart. Daniel's voice, when he finally found it, came out as barely more than a whisper, cracked with 2 decades of suppressed grief and overwhelming love. "Hi, Mom," he said, the words carrying the weight of 20 years of absence, 20 years of wondering if he would ever see her again, 20 years of believing he'd forfeited the right to call her by that sacred name. The community room erupted in gasps and whispers as the other residents and staff members witnessed what seemed impossible. A reunion materializing from thin air, a miracle emerging from the mundane task of fixing a broken pipe. Some of the elderly residents began to cry, recognizing the profound emotion of the moment, even without understanding the specific details. Nurses stopped their activities to observe the scene unfolding before them, their professional training unable to provide protocols for handling such unexpected emotional earthquakes. Elena's face cycled through a series of emotions as her damaged memory struggled to process the revelation. Recognition flickered in her eyes like a light switch being toggled, her mind working to connect the middle-aged plumber with the young man who existed in her clearest memories. But beneath the confusion, beneath the neurological fog that clouded her daily existence, maternal instinct provided certainty that transcended rational thought. "Daniel?" she whispered, the name carrying 20 years of unanswered questions, 20 years of hoping against hope, 20 years of refusing to believe her son was truly gone forever. She reached out with trembling fingers to touch his face, her hands mapping the changes that time had written across his features, searching for confirmation that this impossible moment was real. Daniel caught her hands in his own, hands that had grown calloused from honest work but retained the gentle strength she remembered from his youth. He looked into her eyes and saw not judgment or accusation, but the unconditional love that had sustained her through 20 years of not knowing whether her son was alive or dead. The guilt that had driven him into exile seemed suddenly insignificant compared to the miracle of this moment, the impossibility of finding her here, now, when he'd finally learned to live with loss. The next hour passed in a blur of tears and fragmented conversations, Elena's damaged memory making the reunion a series of rediscoveries as she processed and reprocessed the impossibility of her son's presence. Sometimes she remembered the 20-year gap. Sometimes she spoke to him as if he'd simply been away at college. Sometimes she asked why he'd been gone so long, and sometimes she forgot the gap entirely, speaking to him with the casual affection of a son who'd never left home. Daniel answered her questions with infinite patience, his professional composure completely abandoned in favor of raw emotion. He told her about his work, about the town where he lived, about the quiet life he'd built from the ashes of his engineering dreams. He apologized repeatedly for disappearing, for causing her pain, for being the son who'd failed to live up to his potential. But Elena's responses revealed the simple truth that had sustained her through 20 years of loss. She had never stopped loving him, never stopped believing he would come home, never stopped being proud of the man she'd raised. The other residents and staff gradually gave them space, understanding that they were witnessing something sacred and private. The broken pipe remained forgotten, the repair work abandoned in favor of the more important task of reconnecting two hearts that had been separated by guilt, grief, and the cruel randomness of mechanical failure. Daniel had spent 20 years learning to fix everything except the relationship that mattered most. But sitting beside his mother in that community room, he began to understand that some repairs require not skill or tools, but simply the courage to begin. Elena's condition meant that she would forget portions of this reunion, that tomorrow she might not remember that her son had been found, that the miracle would need to be rediscovered again and again. But in that moment, surrounded by the gentle chaos of a nursing home community room, with water still puddling on the floor from the leak he'd been hired to fix, Daniel understood that his true calling wasn't engineering bridges or buildings, but rebuilding the connection that guilt had severed 20 years ago. He didn't quit his job or return to engineering school. The 20-year-old boy who'd dreamed of designing skyscrapers was gone forever, buried beneath 2 decades of grief and self-imposed exile. But the 40-year-old man who'd learned to find purpose in fixing broken things discovered that the most important repair work of his life was just beginning. He moved to the town where Sunset Manor was located, taking a position with the local plumbing company so he could visit Elena regularly. Their new relationship was built around the gentle rhythms of her condition. Some days she remembered everything, and they would talk for hours about the past, about his father, about the accident that had changed everything. Other days she would introduce him to her friends as "my son Daniel," with the proud smile of someone discovering good news for the first time. And sometimes she would ask him to fix small problems in her room, a loose faucet handle, a sticky drawer, a lamp that flickered intermittently. These small repair jobs became their new language of love. Daniel would arrive with his toolkit, the same methodical arrangement of tools that had triggered her initial recognition, and Elena would watch him work with the satisfied attention of a mother who had always known her son was capable of fixing anything that was broken. Sometimes she would tell him stories about his childhood while he worked, memories that remained crystal clear while yesterday's conversations faded like morning mist. The staff at Sunset Manor grew accustomed to seeing Daniel in the hallways, always carrying his toolkit, always heading to Elena's room to address some minor maintenance issue that probably didn't require professional attention. They understood that he wasn't really there to fix faucets or adjust cabinet doors. He was there to fix the 20-year gap in their relationship, one small repair at a time, building a bridge between the past they'd shared and the future they would navigate together. Elena's friends among the residents adopted Daniel as their unofficial maintenance man, finding small problems that needed his attention whenever he visited. They understood that he needed to feel useful, needed to justify his frequent presence with practical work, needed to express his love through the language of tools and solutions. And Daniel appreciated their kindness, the way they created opportunities for him to spend time with his mother, while maintaining the professional dignity that had become his identity. On good days, Elena would tell him about the years he'd been gone, about the investigators she'd hired, about the sleepless nights she'd spent wondering if he was safe. She would describe the way she'd kept his room exactly as he'd left it for the first 10 years, as if maintaining the physical space might somehow call him home. And she would talk about the gradual acceptance that had come with age, the way she'd learned to love him as a memory rather than a presence, never giving up hope but learning to live with uncertainty. Daniel would reciprocate by telling her about his years in exile, about the guilt that had driven him away, about the slow process of learning to live with what had happened. He described the work that had saved him, the satisfaction of solving problems that had clear solutions, the peace he'd found in honest labor, and he would apologize again and again for the pain he'd caused, for the son who'd disappeared when she needed him most, for the 20 years they'd lost to his inability to forgive himself. But Elena's responses consistently surprised him with their generosity and wisdom. Her damaged memory had somehow preserved only the essential truths about love and family, filtering out the complications and conditions that often burden relationships. She loved him simply because he was her son, not because of what he'd accomplished or failed to accomplish. She was proud of him for becoming a man who helped people, regardless of whether he helped them as an engineer or a plumber. And she was grateful beyond measure that he'd found his way back to her, even if the journey had taken 20 years and required a broken pipe to complete. As the months passed, Daniel discovered that his mother's condition had taught her something profound about living in the present moment. Her inability to form lasting new memories had freed her from the burden of carrying grudges or dwelling on disappointments. Each conversation was fresh. Each moment of connection was received as a gift. Each small repair job was appreciated, as if it were the first time she'd seen his competent hands solve a problem. Their relationship became a testament to the idea that love doesn't require perfect memory or complete understanding. Elena might forget the details of their conversations, but she never forgot the feeling of having her son back in her life. And Daniel, who had spent 20 years believing that his failure to prevent his father's death disqualified him from his mother's love, learned that forgiveness doesn't always require explanation or justification. Sometimes it simply requires presence. The other residents at Sunset Manor began to understand that they were witnessing something rare and precious. A second chance materialized from the mundane circumstances of daily life. Daniel's regular visits became a source of hope for families who had grown distant, proof that love could survive even the deepest wounds and longest separations. His toolkit became a symbol of the idea that everything broken could potentially be repaired, given enough patience and the right tools. Daniel's employer eventually offered him a permanent position managing maintenance for several nursing homes in the area. Understanding that his personal investment in the work made him uniquely qualified for the job, he accepted gratefully, recognizing that his calling wasn't to design monuments to human achievement, but to provide the small services that kept people comfortable and connected. His engineering training had taught him to think systematically about problems, and his 20 years of exile had taught him the value of honest work, skills that combined perfectly for this new phase of his life. Elena's condition continued to progress, her short-term memory becoming increasingly unreliable, but her capacity for joy remained intact. She greeted Daniel with genuine delight each time he visited, sometimes remembering their reunion, sometimes experiencing the surprise of discovering her son anew. But regardless of what she remembered or forgot, She consistently responded to his presence with the unconditional love that had never wavered during their 20-year separation. Their story became a legend among the staff and residents at Sunset Manor, a reminder that miracles could emerge from the most ordinary circumstances. The broken pipe that had brought them together was repaired within hours, but the connection they'd rebuilt would last for whatever time remained to them. Daniel had finally learned that his father's death wasn't a problem he could solve or a failure he needed to fix. It was simply a tragedy that had happened, no more his fault than the worn brake pads that had chosen that moment to fail. The man who had once dreamed of engineering structures that would outlast centuries had discovered that the most important construction project of his life was rebuilding a relationship that guilt had damaged but not destroyed. Every small repair job in Elena's room was both a practical service and a declaration of love, a way of saying what he'd been unable to express for 20 years, that he was sorry, that he'd never stopped loving her, that he would spend whatever time they had left making up for the years they'd lost. Think about the nature of redemption for a moment. Is it found in returning to who we once were, or in accepting who we've become? Daniel never returned to engineering, never completed his thesis, never designed the bridges and buildings he'd once dreamed of creating. Instead, he found his redemption in smaller acts of service, in the daily choice to show up for his mother, in the patient work of rebuilding trust one conversation at a time. If this story moved you, please give it a like and share it with someone who needs to be reminded that it's never too late to come home. Subscribe to Reunions of Love for more stories that prove love can survive even the longest separations and the deepest wounds, and tell us in the comments. Do you believe the truest redemption comes from reclaiming our dreams or from finding peace with our choices?